I landed my private jet, expecting to find my mother waiting on the porch of the farmhouse I'd paid to save. Instead, I found her outside the county auction hall, clutching the deed to an old swamp everyone called worthless. A banker laughed in her face. My half-brother told her to sign the papers and stop embarrassing the family. But Lillian Vale would not let go, not even when the farm was one payment from foreclosure. The jet touched down at a small private airfield just after sunrise. The sky was pale and cold, the kind of winter morning that made every field look abandoned. I stepped down from the stairs in a charcoal coat that cost more than my mother's old pickup. My driver held the door open beside a black SUV, but I stood still for a moment, breathing in the sharp country air. I hadn't been home in years, not properly. There had been phone calls, bank transfers, short holiday messages, promises that I would come soon when the next deal closed, when the next expansion ended, when the world finally stopped needing me for 5 minutes. But the world never stopped, and Lillian always said she was fine. That was why I had come without warning. I wanted to see her face before she had time to prepare. I wanted to drive up the gravel road, walk into the old farmhouse, and tell her she never had to worry again. My clean energy company had gone public the year before. Newspapers called me a self-made billionaire. Investors called me disciplined, but in my own mind, I was still the boy who left Iowa with one suitcase and a mother who stood in the driveway pretending not to cry. The SUV rolled past brown fields, empty barns, and sagging fences. I watched every mile with a growing ache. The town looked smaller than I remembered. The gas station where my father used to buy coffee had become a boarded-up shell. The diner had a new sign, but the same cracked parking lot. Then, my phone buzzed. A message from Malcolm. "Don't go to the farm first. Meet us at the county office. Mom's having another episode." I frowned. Another episode? I read the message twice. Malcolm had never used that phrase before. In every update, he had said Lillian was stubborn, tired, maybe lonely, but fine. Always fine. "Change of route," I told the driver quietly. County office. By the time we arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside the brick building near the auction entrance. Farmers in seed caps, 2 county employees, a woman from the bank holding a clipboard. And there, near the steps, stood Lillian Vale. I almost didn't recognize her. My mother had always been small, but never fragile. She had been a woman of steady hands, clean aprons, and sharp eyes. Now her gray hair had come loose beneath a faded scarf. Her coat was thin at the elbows. Her boots were caked with mud. She held a folded deed against her chest with both hands, as if someone might tear it away from her. Across from her stood Malcolm. He was younger than me by several years, polished in a navy jacket, his smile tight with embarrassment. Beside him was Carl Pritchard, the banker I remembered from town fundraisers, older now, heavier, with the same smug tilt to his mouth. "Lillian," Pritchard said, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "No sane person risks a farm over 10 acres of standing water." A few men chuckled. Lillian lowered her eyes. Malcolm stepped closer to her, his voice soft but sharp. "Mom, sign it, please. You are making this harder than it needs to be." I got out before the driver could open my door. The crowd shifted when they saw me. Expensive coat, private security behind me. The kind of man who no longer belonged on cracked county sidewalks. Malcolm turned first. His face changed so fast it almost frightened me. "Julian," he said, "you're here." Lillian looked up. For 1 second her face filled with something like hope. Then fear crossed it. Not surprise, not joy, fear. I walked toward her slowly. "Mom?" Her lips trembled. "You weren't supposed to see this." That broke something in me. I looked at Malcolm. "What is going on?" Malcolm gave a tired laugh, the kind meant to make everyone else feel reasonable. "She refused the sale again. The bank is trying to help. I'm trying to help. But she keeps clinging to that swamp like it's holy ground." "It is abandoned land," Pritchard said. "Worthless land. Taxes, mud, mosquitoes. That's all it's ever been." I looked at the deed in my mother's hands. I knew the place. Everyone did. The old swamp south of the farm. My grandfather had bought it at a county auction decades earlier for almost nothing. People had laughed then, too. I remembered the jokes. but not the reason my mother never laughed with them. "How close is the farm to foreclosure?" I asked. No one answered. Lillian's fingers tightened around the deed. Malcolm sighed. "One payment, maybe two if Pritchard can stretch it. That's why this has to be handled today." I stared at him. "I've sent money every month." The air changed. Pritchard looked away. Malcolm's jaw tightened just slightly. Lillian whispered, "Julian." I turned back to her. "What happened to the money?" She shook her head, her eyes filling. "Not here." "Mom." "Not here," she said again, and this time her voice carried a quiet panic that made me stop pushing. Malcolm reached for the deed. "This is exactly what I mean. She gets confused under pressure." Lillian flinched. It was small, almost nothing, but I saw it. My mother was not afraid of the bank. She was afraid of Malcolm. I stepped between them. "Take your hand off that paper," I said. Malcolm froze. Pritchard cleared his throat. "Mr. Vale, with respect, flying in on a private jet does not change county deadlines." I looked at him. "No, but it does change who is asking questions." For the first time, Pritchard did not smile. I guided Lillian away from the steps and into the SUV. She sat beside me stiffly, still clutching the deed. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "That swamp paid for your life, before your money ever paid for mine." I turned to her. "What does that mean?" But Lillian only looked out the window, tears sliding down her tired face. At the farmhouse, I went straight to the old desk in the back room, opened the farm account folder, and began sorting through the records. Then my stomach went cold. My monthly transfers had stopped reaching Lillian almost 3 years ago. I stared at the spreadsheet until the numbers blurred. The farmhouse office was silent, except for the ticking wall clock and the distant rattle of wind against the windows. Rows of monthly transfers stretched across the screen. Every payment had left my account exactly as scheduled, but they had not arrived where I thought they had. 3 years ago, the deposits into Lillian's farm account suddenly ceased. Instead, the funds were rerouted to a different account, one I didn't recognize. The account number was similar, almost identical, but the name on it was Malcolm's. My blood ran cold. Malcolm, my own brother. He had been siphoning off my contributions, leaving our mother to struggle while he enriched himself. And the timing, 3 years ago. That's when the farm's financial troubles had truly begun to escalate. That's when my mother's calls became shorter, her voice more strained, her reassurances that she was fine, ringing hollow. I confronted Malcolm that evening. He tried to deny it at first, then stammered, offering weak excuses about managing the funds, investing for the family, protecting Lillian from herself. But the numbers didn't lie. The money was gone, diverted, and the farm was on the brink of collapse because of it. Lillian listened in stunned silence, her face a mask of betrayal. The fear I had seen in her eyes at the county office now made chilling sense. It wasn't just the bank she feared, it was the son who had systematically undermined her. "Why, Malcolm?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this?" He wouldn't meet my gaze. "The farm. It's a burden. Always has been. I saw a way out, a way to modernize, to get us all ahead." His words were hollow, devoid of genuine remorse. He believed he was entitled, that his actions were somehow justified by a twisted vision of progress. Lillian finally spoke, her voice trembling. "You took Julian's help and turned it into a weapon against me, against us." The tension in the room was suffocating. I knew I had to act, not just for Lillian, but for the truth. The next morning, I returned to the county office, but this time, I wasn't asking questions. I was making demands. I presented the evidence of the diverted funds to Pritchard, who, for the first time, looked genuinely rattled. The bank had a legal obligation to investigate, and the implications for Malcolm were severe. But the mystery of the swamp remained. Why was Lillian so desperate to keep it? Why had my grandfather bought it in the first place? Back at the farmhouse, Lillian led me to a dusty box in the attic. Inside, beneath old photographs and faded letters, was a thick, yellowed envelope. It was addressed to her, in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, and marked, "To be opened only if the swamp is threatened." The envelope had been sealed for decades. My pulse accelerated. "What is it?" I asked. Lillian stared at the paper. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she looked directly into my eyes and spoke words that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "This is the reason your grandfather never wanted anyone to sell that swamp." I reached for the envelope, then stopped. Because written beneath the date was a name I had never seen before. A woman's name, Evelyn Harper. And next to it were 3 words: Property Rights Agreement. I stared at the yellowed envelope for a long moment before carefully opening it. The paper inside crackled with age. Lillian remained seated across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked like someone preparing to revisit a wound she had spent years trying to forget. The document was dated decades earlier. It was not a deed, not a will, not a transfer of ownership. It was an agreement between my grandfather and Evelyn Harper. The language was formal, but simple enough to understand. Evelyn had allowed access to a section of neighboring wetland in exchange for a percentage of future profits from cattail harvesting and fiber sales. I frowned. "This isn't about ownership." "No," Lillian said softly. "It never was." I kept reading. Several pages later, I found handwritten notes attached to the agreement. Yield estimates, market contacts, future expansion plans. My grandfather had never viewed the swamp as useless land. He had viewed it as a working asset, a slow asset, one that required patience. I lowered the papers. So, the swamp was part of a business, a very small one. Then why did everyone treat it like a joke? Lillian gave a sad smile. Because most people only respect money when they can see it. The answer lingered in the room. For years, the swamp had never produced enough wealth to impress anyone. It had simply helped people survive. That kind of value was easy to ignore. I spent most of the next day making calls. I contacted attorneys, environmental consultants, property specialists, people who knew more about wetlands than I ever would. One conversation stood out. A conservation advisor in Des Moines reviewed several of the public filings I had gathered. The man called back 3 hours later. "You have a bigger problem than family drama." I leaned back in my chair. "What do you mean?" "Your swamp sits inside a corridor that's become increasingly valuable." "Valuable how?" "Wetland mitigation credits, conservation programs, environmental offsets." I listened carefully. The advisor explained that certain preserved wetlands could generate significant value because developers elsewhere needed environmental credits to balance construction projects. The system was complicated, but the conclusion was simple. Protected wetlands had become far more valuable than most rural landowners realized. My pulse quickened. Suddenly, Hartwell Ridge's interest made perfect sense. And so did Pritchard's persistence. They were not chasing mud. They were chasing future value. The realization left me angry. Not because of the money, because they had targeted Lillian, an elderly woman they assumed nobody would defend. That evening I drove into town. Pritchard's bank sat on Main Street, between a pharmacy and a hardware store. The banker spotted me immediately. "Mr. Vale." I closed the office door behind me. "I have some questions." Pritchard smiled politely. "About the foreclosure? About Hartwell Ridge?" The smile vanished. Only for a second, but it vanished. I noticed. "So you've been doing some research." "You advised them." Pritchard folded his hands. "They approached the bank regarding local opportunities." "Opportunities?" "That's right. You publicly called the swamp worthless. You privately help investors acquire it." I placed copies of the filings on the desk. Pritchard barely glanced at them. The banker sighed. "Mr. Vale, land value changes. Funny how that happened right before you started pressuring my mother." For the first time, tension appeared in Pritchard's eyes. Not guilt. Concern. Concern that I knew more than expected. The conversation ended without answers. But I left convinced of one thing. Pritchard was hiding something. The question was how much. The next morning brought another surprise. A white van arrived at the farm shortly after sunrise. A woman stepped out carrying a folder. She introduced herself as Rebecca Sloan, a buyer from Minnesota. I walked her through the barn. Lillian joined us reluctantly. Rebecca studied old storage racks, drying equipment, and handwritten records. The deeper she looked, the more impressed she became. "These methods are old-fashioned," she said, "but they work." Lillian shrugged. "They always worked." Rebecca smiled. Exactly. For the first time in days, I saw a flash of pride in my mother's face. Not embarrassment, not fear, pride. Someone was finally acknowledging the value of what she had built. Rebecca opened her folder. Inside were years of purchase requests, unfilled orders, canceled communications, letters, emails, business inquiries, all addressed to Lillian. Many had never received responses. I felt my stomach tighten. The pattern appeared again. The same years, the same period when messages stopped reaching me. Someone had been intercepting opportunities. Not just family communication, business communication, income, survival, everything. Lillian stared at the documents in disbelief. I never saw these. Rebecca nodded. I assumed you weren't interested anymore. I already knew who would benefit if those contracts disappeared. But knowing and proving were different things. That afternoon, I drove to the county records office, not to look at deeds, but to examine the public access logs for the past 3 years. I found Malcolm's name, repeatedly, accessing files related to the swamp, to Lillian's business permits, to the farm's financial standing. He had been systematically isolating her, cutting off her income, and ensuring she remained vulnerable. The evidence mounted. The diverted funds, the intercepted communications, the manipulation of public records. Malcolm had orchestrated a calculated campaign to seize control of the farm and the swamp, all while pretending to be the dutiful son. Pritchard, the banker, was complicit, leveraging his position to facilitate the land grab. The next day, I called a meeting at the county office. This time, I brought my own legal team. Malcolm was there, looking pale and nervous. Pritchard was there, his smug smile replaced by a tight-lipped frown. Lillian sat beside me, her hand gripping mine, no longer afraid. I laid out the evidence. The bank statements, the intercepted letters, the access logs. The room was silent as the truth unfolded. Pritchard tried to deflect, to claim ignorance, but the paper trail was undeniable. His actions and inactions had directly contributed to the farm's precarious state. Malcolm, cornered, finally broke. He admitted to diverting the funds, to intercepting the business inquiries, to manipulating Lillian. He confessed to seeing the swamp as a worthless burden, and the farm as an outdated relic. He believed he was saving the family from financial ruin, but his methods were nothing short of criminal. The county prosecutor, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. The investigation would be thorough. Pritchard's banking license was suspended pending review. For the first time in years, Lillian walked out of a public building without lowering her eyes. The crowd outside parted quietly. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked ashamed. A few approached to apologize. Lillian accepted none of it dramatically. She simply nodded, then kept walking. The following months moved slower, the way healing usually did. The foreclosure was eventually resolved after the corrected balances were calculated. I paid what was legally owed and nothing more. I could have erased every problem with a wire transfer, but that was no longer the point. The truth mattered. Accountability mattered. Money alone could not repair what had happened. Malcolm faced civil repayment orders connected to funds he had improperly diverted. The investigation continued beyond that. Some people expected handcuffs. Life was less cinematic. The greater punishment came elsewhere. His reputation collapsed. His relationships fractured. The control he had spent years building disappeared. When he finally came to the farm one last time, he did not come to argue. He came alone. I found him standing near the barn. Neither brother spoke for several moments. The silence felt older than either of them. Finally, Malcolm looked toward the swamp. I kept telling myself I was protecting the family. I said nothing, because both of us knew that was only part of the truth. Malcolm swallowed hard. I was afraid of what once people learned what the land was worth. They'd realize everything Mom did was right. The confession sounded smaller than all the damage that came before it, yet somehow sadder. Years of resentment, years of greed, years of insecurity. None of it had made him stronger, only lonelier. I never offered easy forgiveness. Malcolm never asked for it. Some wounds required more than a conversation, but for the first time, neither man hid behind lies, and that mattered. A few months later, Lillian signed the documents establishing the Vale Conservation Trust. The swamp would remain protected, Future sales required multiple approvals. Development restrictions were written directly into the trust structure. No one would be able to quietly take it again. When she finished signing, she sat quietly for several seconds, then smiled. Not because she had won, because she was finally free from having to defend it alone. I funded something else that summer. A small natural fiber cooperative. Nothing flashy, nothing designed for headlines. The cooperative hired local adults who had been dismissed for years as too old, too slow, or no longer useful. Former farm workers, retired laborers, people who understood the land, people who knew how to work. The first season exceeded expectations. Orders arrived steadily. The cattail fiber sold. The conservation programs generated income. And the swamp that everyone once mocked became a source of dignity instead of shame. The most emotional day came in early autumn. The county hall hosted a public event recognizing local conservation efforts. It was the same building where Lillian had once been mocked for refusing to sell, the same building where people had laughed at the old swamp. This time the room stood when she entered. No one had planned it. It simply happened. Rebecca Sloan handed her the cooperative's first public buyer's check. The applause lasted longer than Lillian seemed comfortable with. Tears filled her eyes anyway, not because of the money, because somebody finally understood. Late that afternoon, Lillian and I walked through the swamp together. The air smelled of water and earth. Cattails moved gently in the breeze. Neither spoke for a while. Then I finally understood something that had taken me years to learn. The swamp had never been about profit. Not really. It had carried my grandfather's promises, Evelyn Harper's loyalty, Lillian's sacrifices, years of survival nobody celebrated. It was proof that value and worth were not always the same thing. I looked at my mother. I used to think you were protecting land. Lillian smiled softly. I was. I shook my head. No. You were protecting a story. For a moment neither moved. Then she slipped her arm through his, and together we stood watching the cattails sway across the water. The pain wasn't gone. The years couldn't be returned, but the lies no longer owned them, and sometimes that was enough.